Welcome everybody. My name is Alison Finley and I teach here in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster. It is a pleasure and an honour to introduce Professor Elaine Hobby from Loughborough University to give our International Women's Day lecture today. In 1999, Elaine published her Oxford edition of the Midwives book, or The Whole Art of Midwifery Discovered by Jane Sharp. And 10 years later, she edited The Birth of Mankind, or The Woman's Book, by Thomas Reynolds. Elaine's interest in 17th century midwifery goes far beyond these two books, though. By inspiring and forcefully encouraging a whole generation of feminist scholars, Elaine has herself proved the midwife to hundreds of books and projects on 17th century women's writing. So her 1988 study, Virtue of Necessity, English Women's Writing 1649 to 88, really exploded the traditional literary canon by opening up the genres in which women wrote. So political pamphlets, cookery books, letters, religious meditations and tracts, as well as poetry, plays and fiction. Like many 17th century midwives, Elaine has worked collaboratively with other wise women or pioneering feminist scholars to bring early modern women's writing to modern readers. And this book, Her Own Life, Autobiographical Writings by 17th Century English Women, which was co-edited by Elspeth Graham, Hilary Hines, Helen Wilcox and Elaine, transformed the way I thought. I could not believe my luck, in fact, when Hilary Hines applied to work in the department here. And it's especially delightful that today Hilary, Elspeth and Helen are all here to celebrate International Women's Day by listening to Elaine's talk on Aphra Behn's Other Worlds. That draws on Elaine's latest midwiving project, long-going midwiving project, to bring forth the Cambridge edition of the works of Aphra Behn. And she's been doing that by editing herself and by managing the international team of co-editors. So a very warm welcome, Elaine, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. I am absolutely delighted to be here speaking in honour of International Women's Day. I looked it up and realised that I have identified as a feminist since even before the United Nations recognised the 8th of March as International Women's Day. So that's pretty good. Normally, I would not speak with PowerPoint. I dislike it a great deal, and if you want to ask questions about that, I'm happy to answer them. But since I couldn't bear the thought of spending 40 minutes looking at my own face on the screen, you have a PowerPoint. There's a lot of text on it. I know that people are not meant to use text, but I'm talking about words, so where's the choice? So what I'm going to do now is share my screen so that you will be able to see lots of words. So, Aphra Behn's Other Worlds. This is a very famous quotation, but one that it's well worth remembering. Virginia Woolf saying to future women and feminist scholars in a room of one's own that all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. And the combination there, of course, of earned, the fact that this is something that we have a right to do, but also the necessity of being able to earn, which of course is part of what a room of one's own is all about, and speaking one's mind, makes it especially appropriate, I think, for International Women's Day, along with all women together. We have talked with the Grand Cathedral that has Behn's tomb in it, and I think we will be able to have a ceremony where we can all let flowers fall upon her grave in due course. I'm going to start by making some very general comments about Behn. This is in part because I know that I'm speaking to really quite a diverse audience. As Alison has just said, there are in present people I've known for most of my life, and there are also students, there are also colleagues whom I don't know at all. So please forgive me if what I'm saying seems to you rather simple-minded and you know all this and why am I telling you this. On the other hand, if I am moving at a pace where you don't understand what I'm on about, then do feel free to either interrupt or to come up with questions later. So Behn was prolific. We think she was born in 1640, just outside Canterbury. We know that she died in 1689. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some works right at the end of her life. But it's a tiny, tiny sample of what she got up to. So what's here on this screen is a list of the at least 17 plays that she wrote. You can see there The Rover, which I think everybody knows. I'm currently editing it. It is the best play in the world. The Widow Ranter, which I shall be speaking about quite briefly. In addition, we're pretty confident that she did write the anonymously published The Revenge. We know that she wrote Like Father, Like Son, but only its prologue and epilogue survived. The play itself was never published. So lots of plays, successful on the public stage, but also a very fine playwright. Lots of poetry. The second item there, you can see her Poems Upon Several Occasions, is her own collection of her verse. And a great deal could be said about that, how she chose to fashion and produce, present herself to her readers. You can see the first thing I've listed there is her translation of Own Only to Paris in Ovid's Epistles. Ovid's Epistles, edited by John Dryden. And that's just there in a way as a little example to you of how well networked Behn was from early on in her career, in fact, much earlier than 1680. She is by no means somebody who stood at the edge and people didn't know her. She was absolutely involved in the key networks of the day. Of some relevance, specific relevance to what I'm going to be talking about, are the two items or the two matters that I've mentioned at the bottom of the screen. Firstly, that in 85 and 87 she edited Poetic Miscellanies, which includes some of her verse, and then right in the last part of her life also was writing poems on public affairs, so poems dedicated to various members of the royal family, for instance, and commenting on births and deaths and so on. I may not come back to this, so I'm now just going to mention the fact that in one of those Poetic Miscellanies, so the third item there, the Miscellany from 1685, there's a poem of hers which is a paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer. And I've just been working on it, and I have convinced myself that she was a committed Anglican who knew the Book of Common Prayer very well. And I'd be very happy to take arguments on that subject. I say that because one of the challenges, I think, of working on Behn is that she has been made in the last 40, 50 years to stand in for so many different needs. People have needed her, feminists have needed her to stand for various positions, beliefs, and haven't necessarily listened to what she said. So, for instance, you'll find criticism arguing that she was an atheist, nonsense, arguing that she was Roman Catholic, I can see no evidence of that, and so on. And I will come back to this in a little bit towards the end, but I wanted to make the point that the paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer is an important element in relation to what I'm saying today. She didn't just write plays and poetry. Fiction included the 3-volume Love Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister, items that are translations like La Montre and Agnes de Castro, and of course the very well-known Arunico, which I'm going to say a little bit about in a moment, unless I hand the baton to Helen Wilcox. She was also, in the latter part of her life especially, which therefore the period I'm going to be talking about, translating non-fiction from French, so her Seneca Unmasked and Discovery of New Worlds, which I'm going to in a moment. Before any of that, before her first play was staged in 1670, she had spent a few months over in the Low Countries working as a spy for Charles II. Her spying letters home survive, and the Behn project is working with the National Archives on a virtual exhibit of those spying letters, which will go live next month, I think, and I'll send John and Alison a link about that when it becomes available. In addition to those things as well, there is various other various texts attributed to her after her death. All of these are going to appear in the Cambridge edition because it seemed to us inappropriate to make a final decision just for ourselves. Oh, that isn't Behn, or yes, we think that is Behn. So things that have been strongly attributed to her since her death are in the edition, including posthumous fiction, which I'm certain isn't hers, but its existence is a very interesting bit of evidence about how well she was selling, how big her name was, that the booksellers would trouble themselves to get somebody else to write under her name because her books would sell. So there's a lot. When John Shadd first invited me to talk on the topic of Behn's Other Worlds, I said that I could talk about having gone all over the world following Behn, which I have. I've been all over the USA, I've been to Paris, I've been to Australia, I've been to New Zealand, looking at copies of Behn first editions that are owned in libraries in those places. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about other worlds in another sense. And that is to say, I'm going to focus on 3 or possibly 4 works from the end of her career, when events in national politics and in the cultural sphere made her so miserable, I think, so dismayed, perhaps helpless, that what she set out to do was to imagine other worlds as a way of finding a way forward. There are 2 key factors here that I put there in the bullet points. The first is I've said that James II is not who she wanted him to be. From early in her career, Behn is closely associated with supporting the Stuart succession. So supporting the idea that Charles II could and should, indeed must, be succeeded by his brother James, despite the fact that James was known to be a Roman Catholic and therefore thought of as a threat both to the faith and to the nation's freedom. So all her career, very actively, very publicly, at least after James had read The Rover or seen The Rover on stage, I doubt he bothered to read it, but seen The Rover on stage and believed that the portrait there of exiled cavaliers was complimentary, that what anyone who knows the Rover knows that what the cavaliers are up to in Naples is vile and disgusting. But James thought that it was a compliment, so much so that he invited her to have a go at a second part, which she dedicated to him in 1681. And my hunch is, and this is no more than a hunch at the moment, that it was that play, it was The Rover in 1677, misread, misunderstood by James and his followers and the committed Tories who thought, oh, Aphra Behn is solidly on our side. And she was to some extent, as far as she was concerned, and this is the relevance to the paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer, really. As far as she's concerned, God had decided that James was to follow Charles. This was God's will, and that one had to therefore, be a Tory, be on the side of the Stuart succession. Once James was on the throne and was actively Catholicising, was involved in militarising, was in various ways turning his back on long-standing Tories who had supported his succession before he came to the throne. I think what the last plays show, the last works show, is increasing scepticism and unease on her part, as was true of a great many Tories who liked the idea of James and were appalled by the reality of him. So part of the context for what I'm going to say then is this sense of, here I have publicly all these years supported James as king, and now look what we've got. What on earth am I going to do? And then meanwhile, having for much of her career written for the more successful of the two London theatre companies, because of the political upheavals, the two theatre companies merge, and by the time one is in the mid 1680s, there's very little need for new plays. The United Company has got so many great hits on its books, it doesn't need new plays. And so the formation of the United Company, the fact they needed very few new plays, is a disaster for several playwrights who commit suicide or end up going to just live in a workhouse or live with a patron because nobody is interested in paying them to write new plays. And it's worth noting that just in those last 3 writing years of her life, of her playwriting, there's no play. In 85-6, there are only 3 new plays on the stage. One of them is by Behn. In 86-7, there are only 3 new plays on the stage. One of them is by Behn. So she is one of the very few people who continues to write new plays. But in an environment in which really she has to find something else to do, something else to write. And so that's the context then within which I'm going to be talking about these 3 what turn out to be end-of-life writings. I say what turn out to be end-of-life writing because that's to me quite important. There is a strong narrative of Behn that's spoken a lot by the critics and biographers, that she spends the last 2, 3, 4 years of her life miserable, desperate, scratching around for money. I think it's nonsense. She's making a lot of money at the end of her life because she's writing so much. She's highly networked, very, very well received, well respected. And if you look at the sheer quality of what she is writing in her last 2 or 3 years, I find it impossible to believe that these are works that are coming out from someone who is desperate, because the creativity, the achievement of what she does is phenomenal. So I've chosen, therefore, 3 works from different genres. A Discovery of New Worlds, which explores the universe. And I'm going to say a little bit, as I'm talking about that, about her other astrological work from that period, her play, The Emperor of the Moon. I'll then go on to her best-known work of fiction, Arunico, and then finally to the play that she was working on, I think probably working on when she died, The Widow Ranta, which is set in Virginia. So here we have works that are to do with the solar system, with Africa and South America, and with the New World in the sense of Virginia. So, A Discovery of New Worlds. See there, I've said, published 1688. It's a translation of Fontenelle's Entretien sur la pluralité du monde. And that date of 1686 is the date of publication of the French original. It's a very extraordinary book. If you've not read it, and I'm assuming that most of you probably haven't, it's worth a look. It is, as I've said there, a dialogue between a male intellectual who thinks very well of himself and a young marquise. But that dialogue is reported by the male intellectual to a male friend of his. And what he does is explain Ptolemaic theory. So the theory that the Earth is at the center of the universe is wrong. and that Copernicus, who first publishes in 1543, that Copernicus is right, that the sun is there at the middle of the solar system and the planets go around it. And in the course of the text of Discovery of New Worlds, this male intellectual speculates that all the other planets in the solar system are inhabited, and that there are also inhabited planets all over the universe. If you're interested in this as an idea, then I'd suggest, if you don't know it already, a very, very good starting point is David Cressy's article that I've got up there. What Cressy explains is that the fascination with the possibility that there are people living on the moon and indeed elsewhere in the universe is part and parcel of what happens as Europeans find that the Americas exist, as there start to be explorations at the Antipodes. So the whole idea that if there are other worlds on this world, if you like, that there could also be other worlds, other people on other worlds. And of course, therefore, usually at least, these understandings of both this planet and other planets are very much from a white European perspective, that the norm is the white European intellectual, and these other places are in various ways strange and perhaps negative. In Behn's translation of this work by Fontenelle, so in Discovery of New Worlds, there's a long translator's preface from Behn, where she describes the book that she's going to translate. And she's translated it, I think, really quite closely. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some extracts from it. And they're pretty close translations of the French original. But having translated the work quite closely, she doesn't want you to think that that is what she would have written, perhaps, if she had been writing about the possibility of there being people living on other worlds. So this is how she describes the work that she's translated. She explains that the narrator introduceth a woman of quality as one of the speakers in these 5 discourses, whom, that's to say the woman, he feigns never to have heard of any such thing as philosophy. So there's your first ironic edge here, you know, that this idiot male intellectual imagines that a woman would never have heard of such a thing as philosophy, and says to her reader, Behn says to her reader, how well he hath performed this undertaking, you will best judge when you have perused the book. So it's up to the reader to decide, has he done this well? But she then goes on, if you'd like to know beforehand my thoughts, I must tell you freely, he hath failed in his design. And as for his Lady Marquise, he makes her say a great many very silly things. Though sometimes she makes observations so learned that the greatest philosophers in Europe could make no better. This is part of why I'm recommending the book to you. Fontenelle really does make women idiotic, and Behn translates it, but she's not having that. So amongst the things that she literally translates are, for instance, this statement that's there in the French, or this is a direct translation from the French. When one travels towards the new discovered world of America, etc., and finds the inhabitants there to be hardly men, but rather a kind of brutes in human shape, and that not perfect neither. So there's your white European perspective on travel. The narrator goes on when talking about the people of Mercury. I believe they have no more memory than the most part of our Negroes. They never think, and are void of all reflection, and they only act by chance and by sudden impulses. So it's not only the Marquise who's made an idiot in Fontenelle's work. In the course of her preface, Behn not only makes the explicit comments about the shortcomings of Fontenelle that I quoted from, there's also this wonderful moment where she's talking about the difference between the English and the French. And she says, and I do not say this so much to condemn the French as to praise our own mother tongue. For what we think a deformity, they may think it a perfection, as the Negroes of Guinea think us as ugly as we think them. Now, there is the unfortunate acceptance there of the idea that people of any race are necessarily ugly, but you can see nonetheless that she's presenting a very different perspective from the one that's there explicit in the work she's translating. Now, we don't know exactly what she wrote when, and this becomes very interesting if you're Behn obsessed as I am. I think it's very likely that Behn was already knew and was reading, perhaps making use of this Fontenelle work when she was working on her greatest last hit play, The Emperor of the Moon. So The Emperor of the Moon is not her last play, but it's the last one performed in her lifetime. And it's the last one to be the most fabulous hit. And The Emperor of the Moon, I think, is a play that's partly informed by her experience of reading what becomes that translation. So if you don't know The Emperor of the Moon, you really should. It is wonderfully funny. A central figure in The Emperor of the Moon is Dr. Baliardo, whose name means Dr. Blockhead. If you know about Commedia dell'arte, you'll know that Baliardo is a stock figure from Commedia. So he thinks he knows everything, and he really knows nothing. And Emperor of the Moon uses Commedia in various ways to create this other world in which all kinds of things can happen that are really very different from what can happen in the real England of James II. Dr. Baliardo is reading books about the moon. He is completely convinced that there are people living on the moon, and that he wants to have grandsons who are superhuman. And the best way to do this will be to marry off his daughter, and indeed, whilst he's at it, his niece, to people from the moon, so that he will have superhuman grandsons and nephews. He is an idiot. He's an extraordinary idiot. He's not only an idiot, he's also highly patriarchal, a really extreme version of the patriarch figure that Behn invents in a more realistic way in other plays. One of the works he's reading, as I've said, is Francis Godwin's The Man in the Moon. And if ever you saw the advertising for this talk, you will have seen this wonderful illustration which comes from Godwin's Man in the Moon. And there is the male narrator. He thinks he's on his way to the moon. He has harnessed, I think in the book it may be 15 geese onto this frame, and they're going to fly him to the moon. In the book, they really do fly him to the moon. The play, as I said, was a fantastic success. It was staged every season until the 1730s, which makes it Behn's second most successful play. This play, which is about the person who believes that there are people on the moon, and where indeed people from the moon supposedly then fly in. When I say staged every season, I maybe should just spend a moment explaining something that I think is too little understood, which is that we know very little, almost nothing, about what was on the stage between 1660 and 1700. There are almost no records. So as long as Pepys is keeping his diary, which of course is finished before Behn's first play is performed, as long as Pepys is keeping his diary, we know when he went to the theatre. There are a handful of other diary entries by other people. There are odd letters that we know about where people talk about having been to theatre performances. And then there are occasions when members of the royal family get a box at the theatre. But the theatre historians Robert Hume and Judy Millis have crunched the numbers, and they advise us that we only know what was on the stage up to 1700, one night in 5. So 80% of what was on the stage in the Restoration period, we do not know. And therefore, with a play like The Emperor of the Moon, we have very few records of its performance after it first appears in 1687, until you get after 1700. After 1700, the theatre companies decide that what they're going to do is advertise daily performances in the newspapers. And we have a complete record of what was on the stage especially in London, all the way through the 18th century. So with a play like The Emperor of the Moon, where you can see that it was staged every season at least once, right the way into the 1730s, it is the only reasonable assumption is that it was also staged every season in the 13 years before 1700, because you're not going to suddenly pick up something that was last staged 13 years ago and make it successful. And I'm making a deal of this because so much of what has been written about Restoration theatre misses this very obvious point, and people talk about the one or two known performances of a play as if they're the only time that play was on stage, whereas a play like The Emperor of the Moon is a stock play. It's performed. The people know their parts. They can do it at the drop of a hat. And in this play, the people who know their parts are all-star. So part of dealing with the problem of people not coming, of no new plays being needed, part of dealing with the problem of getting people to care about the theatre when you've got the small problem of James II, is that you produce a play with an all-star cast. And the players in Emperor of the Moon are fabulous. They're the best comedians of the day. And the play also uses flying machines and other special effects. So Galileo and Kepler fly in, for instance, in the last scene of the play. So there are many reasons why one would go to see this play. There's the extraordinary cast. There's the magic of the flying. There's lots of song and dance and costume and so on. And there's also the possibility, I think, that the play remains so popular because perhaps self-important men and those who mischievously escape their control were always seen as a current problem. So you could always pitch it to the current audience as being one of those things we live with. And as I was writing that sentence, I remembered what I used to have, which was a little embroidery in my own hall, which I bought in the States in '82, which read, "If we can send one man to the moon, why not send them all?" Outrageous. So, Discovery of New Worlds and The Emperor of the Moon as one possibility of Behn's other worlds in the period. The second, of course, is Arunico, and I've just given you a picture of the title page because I like old books. The title page to the original readers, of course, has got in it, as many have commented, a pretty startling contradiction or stress between the idea of being royal and being a slave. As I have said, the question of what the royal succession is really a big problem now for Behn and for many of those who had long been her allies. I was told that most of the people here would have read Arunico, and I'm therefore not really going to say very much about it. Especially, I didn't know that Helen was going to be in the audience, but I'm going to say a little bit about it. The play is, the story is, of course, effectively set in three places. It's set in Europe, because that's where the narrator is from, and it's set in the other two axes of the slave trade. So it opens in Africa, and it then goes with the slaves to the Caribbean, to Suriname. The story is told through the eyes of a white female narrator. And part of what is, to me, so fascinating about these other worlds that the story invents, that Behn invents in the story, are the ways in which the story manifests the inadequacies and the limitations of that white female narrator, which are at least as problematic as those of the male intellectuals that I've been talking about thus far. If you don't already know Arunico well, or have not engaged with it closely recently, a way in that I think is very interesting is to look at what the story does with pronouns, I and we, they and them, you. So here's the narrator talking about Native Americans in Suriname. And as I say, the I and the we, with these people, as I said, we live in perfect tranquility and good understanding, as it behoves us to do they knowing all the places where to seek the best food. So the narrator, I think, is presented to us as somebody who doesn't find this a problematic a statement that people are being used by these white incomers. But this use of the pronouns, I think, alerts readers to another way of making sense of this. So, for instance, she goes on, they being on all occasions very useful to us. We find it absolutely necessary to caress them as friends and not to treat them as slaves. This is the narrator's perspective on Native Americans. And she proceeds, those then whom we make use of, to work in our plantations of sugar are Negroes. So the I and the we that this story sets up as being the perspective from which it's told. So what we have here in this story is three races, is the white narrator and the people she knows who are white. We have the Africans, both those who are not enslaved and those who are, and we have the Native Americans. We have three racial groups. And to my mind, that production of, for instance, threes, triangles, is deeply typical of Behn. She's very skeptical of binaries. It's very unusual to find any kind of binary opposition for her. I think Behn, who lives in my head, endlessly says to me, it's not as simple as that. Every time I think I've made sense of something, in she comes with this objection that it's not as simple as that. And indeed, in this story, one of the moments in it that I really love is what I've called here the othering of white people. So there these white people are visiting the American Indians, and she describes how they, the American Indians, touched us, laying their hands upon all the features of our faces, feeling our breasts and arms, that the white bodies are odd and they're made strange. The story also and repeatedly shows that white people are liars. They lie and they lie again, and they get very offended when they're charged with lying. And so this distance on the white perspective that's offered to us through the white narrator, despite the white narrator, is, I think, in some ways akin to what Behn gets up to with Discovery of New Worlds, giving us the perspective in the translator's preface, which is different from the perspective that's there within the main tale itself. At key moments, this white narrator veers away from the story of what happens to these enslaved people, to talk about herself. Every time she does this, you just want to scream or cry. So here she is, I've said at the bottom of the page here, Arunico's just been enslaved, and he's just had his name stolen. The narrator's assessment of this moment is that his misfortune was to fall in an obscure world that afforded only a female pen to celebrate his fame. Well, I think we're meant to understand that he has got rather more major misfortunes than that, madam. Or when she's talking about, again at the bottom of the page here, I've got Arunico has been whipped and had pepper rubbed in his wounds. And the narrator's assessment is that we white people, were possessed with extreme fear. While we were away, they acted this cruelty. And talks about her new comedy. Or indeed, as Arunico is about to be mutilated and murdered, the narrator's assessment is, I was persuaded to leave the place for some time, being myself but sickly, and very apt to fall into the fits of dangerous illness. Her solipsism is quite extraordinary. And I quite a long time ago now, I think I speculated that what Behn is trying to do as she's writing this kind of late fiction is she's trying to find a way to make fiction do what what she had used the stage for so well. So one of the things you can do with a play is you can make it impossible to work out where the playwright stands, because you have all these characters speaking from their own perspective. And the playwright doesn't have to speak for herself. And what Behn does as she experiments with fiction is to experiment with unreliable narrators who she makes as untrustworthy as she could have made a self-absorbed figure on the stage. I'm fascinated by what she gets up to. If anything that I've just said seems to, it's worth going back to Arunico, I strongly suggest having a look at Cynthia Richards and Marianne O'Donnell's approaches to teaching Aphra Behn's Arunico. Lots of short essays in there from different scholars talking about approaches they've used both in their own teaching and indeed in their own research of ways into the story. And I've noted here that I was using Paul Saltzman's edition of Arunico. So I promised I've got to be finished in 2 minutes, so we're going to work pretty fast now through Widow Ranter. I hope that isn't what you came for. Oh, no, sorry, I wanted to ask that question though. Arunico and others of Behn's fictions especially are often read by critics as if what they give us is Behn's own perspective, her own experience, her own biography. I find that exasperating. And I'm not saying that she didn't exist or that she didn't have real experiences that influenced the way that she saw the world. Of course she did. But I think there has been a long tendency in the reading, especially of Behn, but also of her female contemporaries, of assuming that she's not able to think creatively, that she must be speaking from herself, from her experience. A woman can't think beyond that. And of course, that's nonsense. Anyway, so The Widow Ranter. Again, here's a picture of its title page, and it takes us off to the final place, to Virginia in the New World. You can see from the title page there, of course, published in 1690. Behn had died the year before. I think the play was left unfinished at her death. I could say a little bit more about that, or you could read Anita Pacheco's edition, which is coming out any moment now. So Anita Pacheco edited The Widow Ranter for the Cambridge edition. But the play seems, I think, I'm pretty convinced, as indeed is Anita, that the play was left unfinished at her death, but was soon brought to the stage quite soon thereafter, and it simply didn't succeed. I think in part because it was unfinished. But there it is in this other new world. And indeed, I don't want to work this one to death, but I want to be aware of the fact, at least, that where it's set is Jamestown. And if there's any truth in what I'm saying, that what is agony for Behn at this point in her life is that she had supported James for the throne, to become James II, right through her professional career. To take us to Jamestown, once the real James was on the throne, I think she would have probably done more with that than she actually does, had she ever finished the play. But where she takes us to is a world in which there are Native Americans, of course referred to as Indians in the play, who are presented as noble savages. So that's a very particular kind of European perspective. Yeah. But they speak in iambic pentameter. And they're there to show what Europeans have lost and also what they're doing to the New World. So this is a key moment where the Indian king says to Bacon, to one of his European invaders, "Though I'm young, I'm sensible of injuries, and oft have heard my grandsires say that we were monarchs once of all this spacious world, till you, an unknown people, landing here distressed and ruined by destructive storms, abusing all our charitable hospitality, usurped our right, and made your friends your slaves." I think it's perfectly obvious that that's iambic pentameter. The 1690 printer set it as prose, and the edition that Anita's just completed is the first one that's ever actually rendered the verse in the play as verse. I think it makes a big difference to how one sees how the Native Americans function in this play, what they're doing, and it gives them an extraordinary nobility. The play also has its it has things that we would regret, that I would regret, but perhaps we're meant to regret them. So here's a stage direction. Enter the bagpiper, playing before a great bowl of punch carried between two negroes, a Highlander dancing after it, the widow ranter led by Timorous, and so on. So it's staging for us this extraordinary new world where you have bagpiping and Scotsness, and of course, again, something, you know, some association there with James. You have the enslavement of the black people there. And these various characters, if you know them, you know that what's being staged here altogether is actually very peculiar. What is remarkable about the play, what is new, and what I think is the sign of a new beginning, of Behn trying to find a new way, is what she shows about the figure of the widow ranter. And because it's time that I was finished, I'm going to skip this pretty quickly. In this new world that Behn's inventing in the widow ranter, there are elements of the old world. Perhaps those include what I was just showing on the last slide. They also include the position of the widowed woman, that the widowed woman is financially independent. You can see here that her husband has died and left her with £50,000, which is an absolutely extraordinary amount of capital. But the problem it presents for the widow is that she knows that men will want her for that fortune, because once a woman is married, her husband owns her wealth. So this is what she's concerned about, is whether men only want her for her money. And in this sequence here, what we have is Ranter talking to her servant about her misery at the fact that she's in love with Daring. He has my heart and soul, the second line says there, but he loves someone else, Chrysante, and has run off with her. And the servant Jenny is saying, I've never seen you melancholy. And Widow Ranter isn't doing melancholy. She says, pox on, why should I sigh and whine and make myself an ass and him conceited? No, instead of snivelling, I'm resolved to beat the rascal and bring off Chrysante. And she says, yes, I'm going to fight him with a sword. And indeed, she does. And she says that she's going to make the duel as comical as the best of them. As much in love as I am, I do not intend to die its martyr. And this creation of the imaginative and emotional world of Widow Ranter is Behn at her most essential in a way. So she's taken an old problem of hers, which is the position of women, the economic position of women, the implications that has for them emotionally and psychologically, and she takes it to the new world to see, is there a new possibility here in this new world, a new way out? And indeed, Widow Ranter does indeed, in this unfinished play, manage to produce possibilities for herself, if not for the black people, if not for the Native Americans, that are new possibilities in this new world. So I wanted to end by asking you please to get the library to order volume 4 of the Cambridge edition of the works of Aphra Behn, which has got The Emperor of the Moon and The Widow Ranter in it. And by 2025, everything else will be out as well. And there's a picture of the first book. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed. That was super, Elaine. A lot of different worlds there. And I know we haven't got much time, so I want to open up straight away for questions and comments from anybody in the audience. Catherine.
Oh, sorry, I was just clapping. I was just giving my
right.
But yeah, no, thank you. I'll just voice another thank you for that.
Thank you. That's great. Anybody want to come in with a quick? Helen?
Yes, thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful. I loved all the different worlds you took us to, and what you indicated about Behn at the end of her career, doing all this adventurous stuff. Just a couple of things. The first is I'm so glad you talked about briefly the paraphrase on the Lord's Prayer, which is one of my absolute favourites of her poems, and I think you're absolutely right about the depth of it. There's lots of irony and lots of playfulness, but there's lots of devotion as well. And so I'm very glad you mentioned that. But my other comment, I very much appreciate what you say about her not liking binaries and her being interested in multiple perspectives and viewpoints, and that triangle, which unfortunately in Orinoco is the triangle of the slave trade, which is Europe, Africa, South America. You're right that that triangle is also present in the narrative structure of the text. And I just wanted to add one thing to support that view, which is that when I went to Suriname to research for the edition, I met someone who is Surinamese, who'd grown up there in the 20th century, and said that Orinoco was the first text she had ever read that dealt respectfully with all three racial traditions that went to make Suriname: the European, the Native American, and the African. And that was so pioneering. And for her then to realize that it had been written by a 17th century English woman, that was such an eye-opener for her, and she was devoted to the text from then on. So just it's not a question, it's a corroboration of your view of that openness to perspectives and the rendering problematic and ironic of those perspectives, which is a key feature. And I'm sure you're right that it's linked with the playwright's skill. So thank you for a lovely lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Someone else? While waiting for another hand, could I ask, butting in as the chair, I too was fascinated by this idea of the triangle and of the craft of Behn as a narrator, as a playwright, as a writer, rather than writing from experience, as an imaginative writer. And I wanted to ask you, do you think she's got do you think she ever has a utopian world? An other world?
I think the Widow Ranta herself is as close as she gets to it. I can remember quite early on teaching Widow Ranta to a very, very bright group of students. And so each week I was setting up the work for the following week, and the Widow Ranta was the last place we were going. And I said to the students, I set them work for the next week. And one of them said, "Oh, I bet she's just going to ruin it all, and Widow Ranta won't be allowed to, get what she wants." And I said, well, just wait and see. So yeah, I think Widow Ranta, and I just wish she'd lived for another, 300 years, or at least, half a dozen, because I would love to have seen what she'd have done with that play if she'd ever finished it, and where she'd have gone from there. But I think that's that is her lived experience. She is a white woman who's trying to find a way to make things right for women of her kind of background. Yeah.
Thanks. I can see hands up, but I can't see who's put their hand up. I can just see in the corner of my screen +18. So
I can see Rachel Willie and Catherine Thomas.
Okay. So Catherine, do you want to?
Okay, yeah, it leads quite nicely on from what you were just saying, Elaine. My question was going to be, you mentioned it. I studied the Widow Ranta this year, but for some reason I didn't even know that it wasn't that she died when she was working on it. And you were just saying that you would have liked her to lived on to see what she would have done. Do you think that any significant changes would have happened only in that sense if she'd lived on to see different, like hundreds of years, or what do you think is unfinished about it? Because for me, when I read it, I don't know, I wasn't looking for elements that were unedited or unfinished. What do you think would have happened if she had worked on it for a bit longer?
It's a really interesting question. It isn't something that struck me until we were working on it really closely for the edition. One of the things is that the cast is huge, and I think she would have found a way to slim it down, to still deal with the same things, but without so many people on stage. If you want to look for evidence of unfinishedness, if you look at just at the last scene, It's like people troop on and they troop off, and they troop back on and they troop back off, and decisions are being made by the governors or the people in charge about what's to happen to various people, and actually they contradict themselves. So I think what you've got here is a kind of sketching of what's to happen in the final scene without any firm decisions about it. And similarly, in the middle of the play, there's that court scene with all of the magistrates getting drunk and looking after their mates, and it doesn't add up. There are cases that are brought where it isn't quite clear what's being presented and so on. That isn't Ben in a finished state. That's Ben sketching that she wants something of this kind to go in here, but she hasn't actually worked out yet how it would work on stage. And of course, if one remembers the way that playwrights worked in the day, if she'd been alive, she would have gone in and read the play, or at least read parts of the play, to the cast. The cast would have agreed to take it, and she would then have worked them through rehearsal, and things would get changed to make them work better on stage as she went. And none of that happened, of course. But it's the sheer size of the cast, the untidiness of it, that isn't late Ben, I would say. Does that make sense, Catherine, of your...
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, sorry to say something else, but you're talking about contradictions that don't add up, the things that are playing against each other. And for me, that brings to mind binaries, and you brought that up, that she doesn't like binaries. She doesn't like anything that adheres to, those ideas. So I don't know, maybe there's something to think about there. And
Yeah.
We're saying that a finished Aphra Behn would be something that tidies up contradictions, but then is that contradicting the idea, how she feels towards binaries?
No, you're making a very important point there. I think you're absolutely right. It wouldn't be tidy. But if you look at what is the last play she finished in her lifetime, Emperor of the Moon, that hasn't got loose. It's got things in it where you don't know what you're going to make of this. But that's not the same thing as having stuff where you literally contradict yourself, where you have somebody on stage who's already left the stage, or you have a judgment being made in different directions, sort of judging one thing and then judging another. And yeah, but you're right, it wouldn't have been tidy.
Rachel? Hello.
Yes, I'm now unmuted, aren't I? Thank you for a really fascinating paper. And by coincidence, I was actually teaching Orinoco on Monday. And one of the things my students were really struck by was the role of trust in the text, and how repeatedly trust is betrayed. It made me think more broadly about the role of knowledge, doubt and scepticism. So obviously in The Emperor of the Moon, this reading of books is a pernicious thing, and this kind of constant undermining of what we can know, what we don't know about the world, about reading, about everything really. So yeah, there's a question there somewhere. I'm just not sure how to phrase it as a question.
And that's why she's so extraordinary. And for much of my career, I've worked on a huge range of authors. For the last 6 years, I've worked only on Ben. And I think I might be working only on Ben for the rest of my life. I'm really happy. She's so various, it really doesn't matter. Every time I turn to a new text, I learn something different. I mean, the reason I talked about Discovery of New Worlds today is that I was just preparing the base text for the person who's editing that for us. And I'd never really thought about it. And I thought, oh, here's another new world that I hadn't really brought into my framework. Yeah.
Great. Hilary, would you like to come in next?
Yes, thank you. Just a comment, really, amusing. I don't know even know if it deserves the name of a comment, but I just wanted to loop back to where you started, Elaine, where you were talking about a room of one's own, and the idea that all women together ought to let flowers fall upon her tomb. And then she goes on to say, because, as you quoted, earned you the right to speak their minds, earn 500 a year by your wits, and so on. And I was thinking about that in relation to the rest of A Room of One's Own. And I was thinking about her celebration of Mary Carmichael as kind of turning a corner, with women's writing. And she says, what she says of her is that she had mastered the first great lesson. She wrote as a woman, but as a woman who has forgotten that she's a woman. And I was putting that alongside what you were talking about with Aphra Behn, and I was wondering, and that's, I've taught this text many times, and this is a moment which often gives us pause in our discussion. What do we make of this idea that you write as a woman, but as a woman who has forgotten that she's a woman? And I was thinking about what you were saying about triangulation, about Behn's refusal to fully or over-identify with any particular sort of group or category. So that sometimes, you know, if you think about the use of pronouns in Orinoco, that sometimes she identifies as European, sometimes she completely disidentifies, and so on. And I wondered if there was some kind of way that perhaps what we ought to be celebrating is precisely not, you know, not only the right to speak our minds and so on and so forth, but that strategy of disidentification is perhaps something that's kind of usefully indicative about her work as well.
I like that a lot. Part of what I like most about it is that, you know, one of the things that's commonly said about the long 18th century coffee house as it grows up is that it's a male space, that women don't go there. If you read Behn, you know she went to coffee houses. She talks about, you know, what she's heard said in coffee houses. And what struck me, and this is therefore connects exactly to what Hilary was talking about, Behn didn't go to a coffee house as a woman. She went as a writer. And she's that is the identity that she's speaking from, or that she's thinking from. I also think, though, that her capacity to imagine and invent in words female perspectives on things is pretty extraordinary. I think there are ways in which she is very deeply female, although you go from one text to another, and, you know, another betrayed woman and another betrayed woman and another betrayed woman, and they're all different from each other. So there isn't a single Behnish way to be a betrayed woman, if you like. But yeah, the idea that there isn't, that Behn may indeed be speaking from beyond being a woman, I think is a very interesting one. Certainly some of her male characters are very much more interesting than male characters are in many of the plays by her male contemporaries. They are more complex and more complex in the ways that they interrelate. So yeah, I think she was more than a woman.
Helen, would you like to come for a final question?
You're muted and you've still got your virtual hand up. This is why you're being made to speak.
I didn't know how to remove my lower hand. Oh, there we are. Sorry, no, that was. But I'm very happy to raise my hand and say that I agree with Hilary's point. I think the disidentification, the kind of constantly pulling the rug from under our feet as to who we think speaking and what kind of easy assumptions we can make. I thought that was a lovely point. But no, I didn't. Sorry, that was a technical error. I wasn't wanting to intervene again, Alison. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. I would suggest that, since we're now a bit over the time, that we all unmute at this point and create a cacophony of noise to say thank you to Elaine with our many voices and hands.
I just so wish we could now retire to the pub, but there you go.
Indeed. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.